Hello, today we're making JADAM sulfur. I figure I will just start and then I can chit chat while I'm stirring. So, safety goggles, safety gloves, jacket, boots. As you see, I'm being to the point. The measurements are going to be in the description of this video. So let's start, and the order is very important. Oh, and mask. This is going to have fumes, it's going to have heat. So I'm going to look silly. First is my sulfur. 99.9% sulfur. Whew, how do I do this? You want to do this without getting powder in your face or in the air. Oh, and you want some ventilation. I'm going to be screaming because I assume that you can't hear me with my mask on. Here's my sulfur. I've got some red clay. I've got some rock powder. I'm not sure that this is fine enough. I'm pretty much improvising right now. What else? Salt. I'm using sea salt. And it's coarse, but I'm assuming this is gonna melt. These last three ingredients are to get minerals in our final product. And this is sodium hydroxide. This has actually been sitting in my cabinet for a while, so it got all chunky. And I forgot to break up some of the chunks before I started the video. So I'm doing it now. Okay. Do not handle this with your bare hands. Don't fling it in your face. So there's a video on YouTube that you can see the inventor make this, but he makes them in 100-liter batches. So the point of my video is to show you kind of more of a household use and measurements. Okay, and then, now it's time for the water. This is where it gets scary. Okay. Just so you can see, I don't know if that's gonna see, but it's, this pot right now is filled up to here. You don't want your pot to be too much larger than your final product, because you might have too much surface area and it'll lose heat too fast. And my total final weight should be 0.9 gallons, so just under a gallon. Okay, I don't know why I'm touching it. So I'm gonna make sure it's okay. This is the scary part. This is gonna heat up. When you pour this, you make sure you pour it all at once. If you pour a little bit at a time, this can boil. So this is gonna be called the initial water in the description. And it's already boiling. I also have emergency cold water right here, just in case it does boil, and it looks like it is boiling. This is scary. Yep. I might put in some of my emergency water if it doesn't stop boiling. When you're stirring, you want to stir with a wooden stick. And your pot can be stainless steel or plastic. That is hot, but not aluminum. And you want it to get hot because it has to melt the sulfur. And there's no need to rush it. You can stir it slowly, hitting the spoon to the bottom of the pot, making sure things aren't sticking to the bottom. So I'm hoping that initial bubbling has subsided. And in fact, I should probably be pointing the camera into the pot, but I can also describe it. You know, it bubbled at first. I'm hoping my improvised ingredients wasn't the cause of that. And I should have gotten a timer for this. I do have my phone. But what I'm expecting is that in about 10 minutes, this will be mostly melted, all the powders, that is. And within 30 to 35 minutes, it'll be completely dissolved. You do not want to use a drill. I have a screen door open behind me, but this door doesn't have a screen on it. So I didn't want all the bugs to fly in. I can feel some powder sticking to the bottom. It's not boiling. When you're making a big batch, it is okay to use a drill towards the very end if you want to save like 10 minutes. But I think with our little household batches, there's no way I'm going to use a drill. I'll just take the extra 10 minutes. Put my emergency water back. Slowly, it'll get hotter and hotter. It would be cool if I had a thermometer, but I don't. Let's just say it's pretty hot. If you do use a plastic container, you want it to be like a thick plastic container. And then you want to like designate that container to just be making this stuff. I think I'm going to bring the camera over here so you can see what it looks like to me. So naturally, some of the sulfur is going to stick to the sides and to your spoon. And then you can just, and I've just been scooping it up and letting it kind of full. I don't know if you can see the fumes coming up. As I'm scraping the bottom, I can hear some sand on the bottom, but I think what we're looking for is to see if there's any of that yellow sulfur left. And as I scoop the bottom of the container and I lift, see, I still see some powder, but some of that could be some of the stuff that I added. So okay, so those hard chunks, I think that might be the sulfur. So we're going to keep stirring until we don't see those anymore. So while I'm doing this, I can explain the ingredients that I improvised on. So the three optional ingredients to this are phylite powder, red clay powder, and salt. Most of us have salt, so of course I added that. I was able to find some red clay powder on Amazon. I'm sure it wasn't the same that they use in South Korea, but I just made sure the ingredients just said red clay on it. So, and I used such a small amount, I would say the price is pretty much negligible, but you can just skip that step if you don't want to. But it's that red clay that gives this the color. So I just found another sulfur chunk. And then the thing that made me most nervous, the substitute that made me most nervous, was the phylite powder. And there's no place in the universe, in the internet universe, that I was able to find phylite powder. So I just looked up what that is. I think Wikipedia said it was like mostly quartz. So I found a sand, it was like a pure sand. I don't remember if it was described as having quartz, but even that's pretty rare. But I made sure it didn't have dye in it, that it was just no more than pure sand, because you can substitute fine soil, and I know soil is thinner or finer than sand. But I figured even if it doesn't dissolve, it'll just stay on the bottom. And those ingredients are expected to settle on the bottom anyway. So I guess you can say I just figured that if it's not going to entirely melt, that's okay, as long as the sulfur is melting. So anything that you see that's yellow. So it's been a little more than 10 minutes. And I would expect, since we have a little batch here, that kind of like with the JWA, it's not going to take as long as it does if you're making 100 liters. So I'm scraping the bottom, looking for any yellow rocks, and I'm making sure that I'm pulling up the liquid to get everything that's on the edges or the sides. Pull it down. I still feel some grit on the bottom, so I'm just gonna try to break it up with my spoon. So I'm gonna top this off with water as my final mixing step. But when I do that, it's going to cool it down. So that's why you want to make sure everything's melted in this initial water. As I'm doing this final scraping, I'll just say that it's darker now than it's going to be tomorrow when when everything settles, all this sediment settles to the bottom. And if you don't add those optional ingredients, you don't have to wait 24 hours for those powders to settle. I think I'm kind of overkilling this. I think it's pretty much done. It's just that I'm feeling the grit sticking, and I figure I don't think it hurts to just give it a little extra time. Now, if you didn't add any more water at this point, what would happen is the sulfur would crystallize over time. So the additional water that we're going to add is to keep the sulfur from crystallizing, so long as we store it in an airtight container. You want to keep it out of sunlight. It could freeze and then it will just thaw, so that's okay, but you don't want it to be too cold either. And it's okay to store it in plastic, but if you do, you want it to be thick plastic. If you put it in a thin plastic water bottle, for instance, it's going to melt it. It's going to leak through that. And you don't want to see that happen. Also, I've kept some of this in a container that was not airtight, and it crystallized on me. It took a while, but it finally did. I'm going to call that done. What I did to this spoon. I sacrificed this spoon because it was just this cheap Walmart spoon and it was already crooked, so I wasn't really using it for anything else. Just so you can see, this is what crystallized JADAM sulfur looks like. This is from, was it July 2019? Yeah. And it took a while for it to crystallize, but you can see it wasn't an airtight container. It was just like that. But one day I noticed that it did that. So also, you could see like the air to JS kind of ratio. So there's a lot of air in there as well. So that's what that looks like. So I am going to add my second water. So this is going to cool it down and keep that from crystallizing while we wait 24 hours. And notice how my container is just a little bit bigger than this final solution. So it comes up quite nicely. So now I'm going to let that settle for 24 hours. Like all the powders are going to sink to the bottom. And you want to make sure it's airtight. I think that's about as airtight as I'm gonna get. It's still pretty warm. So while that's doing its thing, I'm gonna read some bullet points. It's probably good to point out that when you use this as a pesticide, you're not going to use it full strength. You're going to dilute it, and it depends, you know, what you're using it for when it comes to what that dilution is going to be. Let's say you're going to have a 500 liter batch of pesticide. You're going to use, of that amount, as little as 0.5 liter of this is going to go in that, and the rest of it's going to be water. But it could go as high as 5 liters of this to a 500 liter solution. And if you're going to do that kind of strength, that's probably when you're using it in the winter for pest control. So this works for just about any pathogen. Some examples: powdery mildew, downy mildew, fungus, black spot, anthracnose. It can be applied to all crops. There's no expiration date. He says it costs about $1 per liter. When you make it this way, I'm not doing my own estimate like I did with the JWA, just because there's so many optional ingredients and it really depends on the dilution in terms of the cost. So just take his word for it. When you apply the pesticide, you want to do it in the early morning or at sunset. You don't want to do it when it's hot in the middle of the day. It doesn't damage any plastic that you might use or any pipes, like I think they said some other sulfur products could do. And be cautious when applying it to persimmons, grapes, and squash, and jujube, because these crops are sensitive to it. The pathogens don't develop a resistance to this, which is pretty neat. And with most of these or all of these products, you want to, you know, maybe test it out on something before you just apply it to everything. Although I usually don't do that. I definitely suggest that you just go ahead and watch the JADAM Sulfur video that this company put out on their own YouTube channel. You don't want to store it in the same container that you made it in. The problem that I'm having is either due to the sand or the red clay powder. It's possible the red clay powder was too fine and so it's not settling, because he does warn that the azomite shouldn't be added because it's too fine. And the red clay powder that I found was very fine, so it could be that, but it could also be the sand as well. Maybe when it broke down, it I don't know, it just broke into these funny particle sizes that aren't settling. It should just be the red without the floaty things. This should be like a light red, and this sediment should have fallen to the bottom of my other container at the end of 24 hours, and it hasn't. I will see if over time it settles, and if so, if I want to use it, I'm just gonna skim off the top. But you can see this is half a gallon and 2/4 gallons, so as I measured out, this is about 1 gallon of solution. This would last you a long time when you consider how much you have to dilute this in water before you apply it. My hands smell like sulfur. They also smelled like sulfur last night, even though I was wearing gloves. So I'm wondering how it got on my skin. It might have gone through the gloves. So be prepared to get a little sulfur on you even when you wear gloves. If you've ever drunk well water that has sulfur in it, it kind of smells like that. So actually, come to think of it, it should only be red if you do find the good red clay powder and you add it. So I think it might just be this yellow color if you don't add any of those optional ingredients. So I'm not sure. I've only seen it with the red clay powder in it. So either way, what you want to see is just a clear liquid with any sediment on the bottom. And actually, you wouldn't have any sediment, and you wouldn't have to wait 24 hours if you didn't put in those optional ingredients.